It's important to know the context of this passage, and it follows immediately after Jesus heals a man born blind. And the Pharisees, at least some of them, said that Jesus couldn't possibly be of God, but instead was a sinner because he'd healed on the Sabbath. And they threatened to cast out anybody who called Jesus the Messiah. And the whole of this chapter is Jesus' answer to his critics. Now, in Jesus' day, lots of families would have had a few sheep, but not enough to warrant a full-time shepherd. So one young man from the village would act as shepherd of the sheep of the entire village, which would make a decent flock. The structure of the houses was such that at the back of the living quarters there was a small courtyard with very high walls and a door. This was to prevent burglary, and this is where the sheep would be kept. And every morning the shepherd would go to each household and knock at the door. The gatekeeper, the doorkeeper, would answer the shepherd and open the door, and the shepherd would call the sheep, who would follow him, knowing that they were going to get food. Now, due to the arid nature of much of Israel and Palestine, sometimes the shepherds had to take the sheep quite a long way away from the village to get good pasture. This meant that the sheep had to know and trust the shepherd, because they had to obediently follow him from pasture to pasture if they were going to thrive. The hot, dry climate meant that in the driest summer months, often the shepherd would have to take the sheep so far from the village that they wouldn't return home at night, but they would stay out in the fields. And in most of the fields there was a circular enclosure, which is where the sheep would stay at night. This enclosure had lower bramble-topped walls to prevent wild animals from jumping over, and it would have no door, no gate. So the shepherd would lie across the opening and would in fact become the gate for the sheep. Now, in verses 1 to 6 of today's gospel passage, we clearly have a village setting, because there wouldn't be a doorkeeper or a gatekeeper in the open country. Jesus is casting himself as the true shepherd, and the Pharisees, the unbelieving Pharisees, as thieves and robbers. But the Pharisees don't seem to pick up on the point that Jesus is making. So from verse 7 onwards, Jesus changes the scene to where the shepherd has taken the sheep out of the village, far from the village, where they are more in need of his protection. The Pharisees have cast out the man born blind because he followed Jesus. He didn't follow the Pharisees. They had also cast out anybody else who recognised Jesus as the Messiah. But Jesus offers both protection and provision for those who follow him. But by calling himself shepherd, Jesus was hinting at his identity as both Messiah and King. The mere mention of the word shepherd would have caused his hearers to think of passages like Psalm 78 and Ezekiel chapter 34. They knew their scriptures very well, and this would come to mind, because shepherd's imagery was used to describe kings. In Psalm 78, the great King David is pictured as shepherding his people. And in Ezekiel 34, God condemns the leaders of his people by calling them bad shepherds, and he promises to send a good shepherd to lead the flock. And here is Jesus portraying himself as a shepherd, the true shepherd. Indeed, in later verses, he actually refers to himself not as a shepherd, but the good shepherd, whose sheep know his voice. Now, the book Sitting at the Feet of Rabbi Jesus it's by Anne Spangler and Lois Furberg, and it describes how a doctoral candidate at the University of Durham spent many months each year in Israel to study. And one day while she was there, she was walking on a road near Bethlehem, and she saw 3 shepherds, each with a flock of sheep. They all came together and converged, and the shepherds greeted each other and began chatting. And as they did so, the sheep all intermingled and made one huge flock. And this student watched and wondered how on earth the shepherds would recognise their own sheep when they'd finished talking. So she stood and she watched. And as the shepherds said their goodbyes, each one called out to his sheep, and immediately the sheep followed their shepherd, and they separated once again into 3 separate flocks. And the passage in the books ends by saying, apparently in Israel little has changed, in thousands of years. Now our gospel passage ends by Jesus speaking of finding pasture for his sheep being well fed and having abundant life. So my questions to you today are these. Do you recognise the voice of the Good Shepherd? And will you obediently follow him so that you can be spiritually fed and live an abundant life? I would end there, but I have to say that to obediently follow is not always easy, especially if you like where you are. But God often has pastures new for us. And it's my duty as incumbent to inform you that the Reverend Sally Robinson, who has loved being here with us as much as we have loved having her to minister among us, has been appointed, and I have to read a formal notice. Reverend Sally Robinson has been appointed to the post of incumbent of St Margaret Heywood, St George Heap Bridge and St James Heywood. The date of her licensing is yet to be confirmed, but it's likely that she will only be with us for another 2, possibly 3 weeks, as she will need time to prepare for her new post, where I pray that she will be spiritually fed and be able to extend her ministry, being an incumbent rather than an assistant curate. And I pray that she will experience an even more abundant life. Amen.